Everything suddenly fell into an eerie silence, not because the conflict had ended, but because the violence had gone far beyond what any camera could capture. When a nation almost vanishes from the internet, when thousands are killed, but the world sees only blank spaces in the news, it's no longer a protest. It's the sign of a regime in crisis. Iran is standing right on that edge. And what's unfolding behind this curtain of silence could shake the entire Middle East in the days to come. If you're someone who values deep, slow, and to-the-point geopolitical analysis, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss videos like this. Now, let's begin. There are certain numbers that, when spoken aloud, don't need any adjectives to be horrifying. Numbers that don't just measure events, but measure the brutality of an entire chapter in history. The figure of 5,000 people killed during protests in Iran, confirmed by an Iranian official to Reuters, is one of those numbers. It's not just a death toll, it's a deep gash in the image of stability that the Tehran regime has long tried to project to the world. What makes that number truly terrifying isn't the scale alone, though 5,000 lives lost is an immense tragedy for any society. The fear lies in the fact that this was an admission, a rare one. From a regime known for denial, obfuscation, information control, and distortion of the truth, this was a crack in the iron curtain of media control, revealing a sliver of the reality behind it. When an authoritarian government allows even a partial glimpse of the casualties, it usually means the real situation is far more dire. For weeks, Iran shook. From Tehran to Mashhad, from Isfahan to cities once considered the regime's loyal strongholds, the streets overflowed with people. These were no longer isolated chants or symbolic marches. It was a wave of anger, persistent, spreading, day after day. The world watched Iran with the sense that something monumental was unfolding, something that could change the course of the entire Middle East. Then, almost all at once, it stopped. Videos faded, news became fragmented, the internet faltered, then vanished. Iran disappeared into a troubling information void. To many outside observers, that silence was easy to mistake as a return to order. The protests must have died down, the regime must have regained control. But Middle Eastern history has never moved according to surface-level logic. In societies on the edge, silence that comes too swiftly rarely means peace. More often, it signals that violence has temporarily won, that what's happening behind closed doors is far more brutal than anything that ever made it to our screens. And it's in this context that the firm rhetoric from Washington, open calls for a different future for Iran, and the movement of U.S. military assets into the region becomes especially notable. These moves didn't happen in a vacuum. They came precisely when Iran was at its quietest, and perhaps at its most vulnerable. Big questions begin to emerge. Just how deep is the internal crisis that Iran is facing? If the outside world is now forced to consider such serious scenarios. And are these protests really just another wave of unrest? Or are they the visible tip of a far deeper process, decades of simmering frustration that has now reached the point of no return? To answer that, we have to look beyond these recent weeks of protest. We need to rewind, to examine the very structure of power, economy, and society that has been quietly building pressure inside Iran for decades. Because what we're witnessing today isn't a sudden spark. It's the inevitable result of a long, slow accumulation, a process in which every wave of repression only pushed the fire deeper underground, but never truly extinguished it. From the outside, many still tend to describe what's happening in Iran as a sudden wave of protests. But that phrasing unintentionally downplays the true nature of the crisis. Because what we're witnessing today is not a knee-jerk reaction to a single incident. It's the visible tip of a pressure buildup that has been silently accumulating for decades, smoldering, repressed, and never truly released. Since the Islamic Revolution of 1979, Iran has been shaped into a theocratic state, where ultimate power doesn't come from the ballot box, but from a clerical establishment. In its early years, this model carried a sense of unity and revolutionary legitimacy. But over time, as the generation that lived through the revolution faded into the background, lofty ideals began to clash more and more with everyday realities. Personal freedoms were choked, economic opportunities shrank, and a young, dynamic, highly educated society gradually realized that their future was locked inside a nearly unchangeable structure of power. The protest waves of 1999, 2009, 2017, and 2019 weren't isolated events. They were like recurring cracks in the same wall. Each time the regime cracked down, it might have restored order in the streets, but it also pushed a new layer of discontent deeper into the core of society. The anger never went away. It simply learned to stay silent, to wait, to build. What sets the current wave apart is this. The pressure has now spread so widely, it's no longer confined to a particular class or social group. When workers, small business owners, students, women, even families once tied to the state apparatus, all take to the streets together, this is no longer about reform or isolated demands. It signals a rupture that cuts across the whole society, where the feeling of betrayal by long broken promises has become a shared experience. The economic backdrop only makes that pressure more suffocating. Skyrocketing inflation, a collapsing currency, daily life growing harder, while an elite class linked to the Revolutionary Guard continues to enjoy wealth and privilege. The gap between the revolutionary state and the people's actual lived reality has never been more exposed. And when people no longer believe that today's sacrifice will lead to a better tomorrow, resignation begins to dry up too. But more important than economics is the collapse of trust. A regime can endure for a long time if its people believe it stands for something legitimate. But when power must constantly rely on large-scale violence to maintain order, that legitimacy begins to fracture. Every bullet, every crackdown doesn't just suppress a protest. It chips away at the moral foundation the regime stands on. That's why the recent pause in protests should not be mistaken for resolution. It's more like a heavy silence after a society has been pushed to its breaking point. A silence where no one truly believes that things are okay, but few still have the means to express their rage out loud. And it's precisely at this moment that a critical element emerges, one that makes the silence even more chilling: the near-total disappearance of the internet. When connection is severed, when voices can no longer find each other in digital space, then frustration stops expressing itself in the familiar forms of images or chants. It morphs into something else, quieter, more dangerous. A new form of resistance, where the battlefield is no longer in the streets, but in the information war the state now controls absolutely. In every modern crisis, control over information is nearly as crucial as control over the streets. And in Iran, when protests spread beyond what could be suppressed with batons and rubber bullets, the state turned to a different weapon, quieter, but far more effective: the forced silence of the internet. When over 90% of the country's internet traffic was shut down, Iran didn't just vanish from the world's view. It fractured its own society into isolated fragments. People could no longer see what was happening in the next city. They no longer knew whether they were alone. The videos that once spread like wildfire now existed only in memory. And in that vacuum, fear began to drown out anger. In modern resistance movements, the internet is more than just a communication tool. It's a psychological lifeline. When someone takes to the streets and sees thousands of others doing the same, they feel part of something larger. Cut that line, and each group becomes isolated, easier to defeat one by one, and more importantly, easier to convince that their resistance is hopeless. This isn't a new tactic, but it's grown more sophisticated. Instead of hiding the violence itself, the regime only needs to hide the images of violence. No videos, no online witnesses, no global outrage. What happens in the dark becomes harder to verify, harder to challenge, and therefore easier to deny. The truth isn't erased. It's buried beneath silence. The most chilling thing about that silence is the illusion of stability it creates. To the outside world, Iran might seem calm. No more clashes flooding social media, no trending hashtags. But for those inside Iran, the quiet feels entirely different. It's the sense of being trapped in a sealed room, where cries for help can't break through the invisible wall of state-controlled information. For Western intelligence agencies, Iran going dark online isn't a sign that the crisis has cooled. On the contrary, it's often a red flag that things have entered a far more dangerous phase. Without access to public data, they're forced to rely on satellites, electronic signals, and on-the-ground networks. And historically, conclusions drawn from this kind of silent data are rarely reassuring. That's why Iran's silence is not a harmless pause. It's a phase of power recalibration, where the state tries to regain the upper hand by seizing control of the public's perception, while society is forced to swallow its outrage in silence. It's the most dangerous form of instability, because not even those in power can be sure how much pressure the system can still endure. And it's within this fog of uncertainty that external reactions begin to take clearer shape. As Washington watches Iran sink into an information blackout, it sees not just a society under control, but a growing strategic risk. Because an Iran that's locked down with no internal outlet for dialogue tends to push its tensions outward. At that point, the question is no longer just what's happening inside Iran. It shifts to something much bigger. What is the United States preparing to do in response to an adversary that is both internally unstable and increasingly willing to use force to break the deadlock? And when information is buried in darkness, Washington is forced to answer that question, not with words, but with diplomacy, deterrence, and a clock that's running out. When observing America's maneuvers around Iran, many are left with the impression that Washington is hesitant, even contradictory. On one hand, there are soft diplomatic statements, calls for restraint, and an emphasis on peaceful solutions. On the other, warships, bombers, and missile defense systems are quietly being deployed across the Middle East. But within the logic of U.S. strategy, this isn't hesitation. It's how time is bought in a situation where time is both an asset and a looming threat. To Washington, Iran is not a single-track crisis. It sits at the intersection of multiple simultaneous concerns: the stability of the Middle East, global energy security, the safety of Israel, the viability of U.S. bases in the region, and even America's strategic credibility in the eyes of its global rivals. Any decision could ripple far beyond Iran's borders, which is why the U.S.'s instinct is not to rush in, but to expand the decision-making space. Diplomacy, in this context, isn't just meant to persuade Tehran. It's a signal to allies and partners. When the U.S. talks about diplomatic solutions, it's also reassuring the world that Washington is still in control of the tempo, that every scenario is on the table and being weighed carefully. At the same time, the military deployments serve as an unspoken reminder. If talks fail, the consequences will be anything but cheap. That's the underlying logic of U.S. deterrence. It's not designed to trigger an immediate strike, but to force the adversary to calculate, because a hasty, symbolic attack won't solve the Iran problem. It could even make things worse, pushing Tehran into a nothing-to-lose mentality. If intervention becomes necessary, the U.S. would need to act with clear objectives, overwhelming force, and, most importantly, a plan for what comes the day after. And it's that question, what happens next, that's making Washington pause. On paper, regime change may look tempting. In reality, it's a nightmare. The lessons of Iraq, Libya, and Afghanistan are still fresh. A chaotic Iran, shattered at the center, could open a power vacuum far more dangerous than a hostile but orderly one. On the flip side, pressuring Tehran just enough to force concessions doesn't guarantee success either, because for Iran's leadership, concessions often mean political suicide. That's why what the U.S. is doing right now feels like standing before a door it doesn't want to open, but also can't afford to turn away from. It's deploying forces not because war has been chosen, but because Washington can't risk being caught off guard if war becomes inevitable. The time being bought with diplomacy and deterrence is time for watching Iran's internal instability, watching the responses of proxy forces in the region, and watching American public opinion, which is always a crucial factor in any military decision. But time doesn't always favor Washington, and Iran, compressed from within, cut off from information, and under mounting pressure, may try to break the stalemate by acting outward. And that possibility makes all of America's calculations more fragile, because all it would take is a single unexpected incident, an attack on a U.S. base, a major clash at sea, or a strike on a key ally, for the window of choice to snap shut. And it's at this point that many begin to ask, if real conflict breaks out, is Iran weak enough to be subdued quickly? The answer, in truth, is far more complex than military budgets or carrier counts. Because in the modern chessboard, power isn't just about what can be seen, it's about how much pain you can inflict in unpredictable ways. And that's when we have to confront a reality Washington understands all too well. Iran is not as weak as many still believe. When placing Iran on the scales against the United States, the disparity in military strength is undeniable. Defense budgets, technology, global strike capabilities all tip overwhelmingly in Washington's favor. But if we stop at those numbers and conclude that Iran is a weak adversary, that's not just an oversimplification, it's a dangerously flawed perspective. Because modern warfare, especially in the Middle East, is rarely settled by straightforward comparisons. Iran understands full well that it neither needs to nor can defeat the US in a head-on confrontation. What it aims for is not a conventional military victory, but the ability to make the cost of war politically, economically, and psychologically unacceptable. And within that logic, Iran's strength reveals itself in a very different form. The first layer of that strength lies in the massive missile arsenal Iran has quietly and patiently built over many years. These aren't symbolic weapons, they're a credible tool of deterrence. Even if just a small portion of those missiles were to bypass defense systems, the consequences would go far beyond physical damage. The political shock alone could ripple across the globe. In a region as sensitive as the Middle East, crisscrossed with energy corridors and military bases, a single precise strike could set off a chain reaction with global implications. Then there's Iran's growing and increasingly sophisticated UAV drone network. They're cheap, hard to detect, and can be deployed in large numbers. In asymmetric warfare, drones don't need to cause mass destruction to be effective. They only need to apply continuous pressure, forcing the opponent to spend enormous resources defending against low-cost threats. When a $10,000 drone requires a $1 million response, the cost equation begins to skew heavily. But the most critical element of Iran's power isn't in any visible arsenal. It lies in its vast network of proxy forces spread across the region. Hezbollah in Lebanon, armed groups in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. Together, they form a dispersed strategic battlefield, where conflict is no longer contained within Iran's borders. Any confrontation with Tehran risks becoming a multi-front war, prolonged, decentralized, and difficult to control. The US might win the major battles, but it would be drawn into a grinding war of attrition that tests time, patience, and political will. Iran also understands another harsh truth. In democracies, especially in the US, wars aren't won solely on the battlefield. They're fought in the court of public opinion. All it takes is a few high-profile casualties, a spike in energy prices, or images of chaos spreading across media, and political pressure at home skyrockets. That's the space Iran seeks to exploit, not to win outright, but to make the fight too costly to continue. This is why Washington does not underestimate Tehran. America's caution doesn't come from fear of defeat, but from the understanding that Iran is the kind of adversary that can turn every scenario into something far worse than expected. Iran isn't strong in the traditional sense, but it is dangerous enough that it cannot be ignored. And yet, from the outside, a persistent illusion remains that a regime under such enormous pressure, rocked by internal protests, isolated internationally, must surely be on the verge of collapse. That illusion has fueled miscalculations time and time again. To understand why Iran doesn't simply give in, why it hasn't relinquished power despite the pressure, we need to examine the regime's survival logic. A logic where concession isn't a path to stability, but the shortest road to total collapse. One of the most persistent assumptions whenever Iran plunges into crisis is the belief that the regime is teetering on the edge of collapse, that enough internal and external pressure will eventually force the leadership to let go, or at the very least, accept a peaceful transition. But modern Iranian history, and the history of similar regimes, suggests that this is not just an optimistic view, but a dangerous one. The nature of power in Iran does not allow for a safe exit. For those at the top, power is not merely a political position, it is the only shield they have against retribution. In a system where the state, ideology, and security apparatus are tightly interwoven, losing power means losing everything: wealth, freedom, and at times even life itself. This understanding makes the idea of concession nearly unthinkable. Unlike governments that can lose elections and step down, Iran's regime is engineered to function in a constant state of confrontation. Ideology isn't just window dressing, it is the core justification for its rule. When a regime defines itself as the guardian of a revolution, as a bulwark against external enemies, any act of de-escalation is easily framed as betrayal. And once labeled a traitor, even from within, the system itself moves to eliminate those who suggest compromise. This is why, after every major wave of protests, Iran doesn't emerge with meaningful reform, but rather with an emboldened security apparatus. For the leadership, repression isn't the most brutal option, it's the most rational one for survival. They believe violence may tarnish their image, but concessions threaten their existence. And when faced with two evils, they will always choose the one that ensures their continuity. Another factor often underestimated is the system's capacity for self-replication. Even when a powerful figure steps down or dies, the structure remains intact. Overlapping centers of power, carefully planned succession mechanisms, and a vast web of vested interests all bind their fate to the regime's survival. This makes the hope that a single major shock will bring down the system a dangerously naive expectation. In fact, external pressure can sometimes have the opposite effect. Faced with sanctions, threats, or the specter of military intervention, Iran's regime often seizes the opportunity to reinforce its narrative of a besieged nation. In such an atmosphere, dissenting voices are easily branded as foreign agents, and segments of society, even those discontented, choose silence out of fear of chaos or foreign domination. That's why expecting a linear, self-driven collapse is an illusion. The reality is far more complex. The Iranian regime may weaken. Its legitimacy may erode. But that doesn't mean it will relinquish power. On the contrary, when backed into a corner, it tends to harden, to consolidate, and to accept greater risks in order to hold on. This is the central paradox of Iran's crisis. The more pressure it faces, the less likely it is to reform, and the more likely it is to choose confrontation. This means the future doesn't depend solely on the depth of public discontent, but on how that pressure is released. And as the door to peaceful transformation narrows, the risk that the deadlock will be broken by a major collision, from within or from without, grows increasingly real. Iran today is not a country gradually returning to stability after a crisis. It is a nation under pressure, where the quiet on the surface masks deep, unpredictable undercurrents beneath. Protests may have subsided, the streets may seem calmer, but that does not mean discontent has disappeared. On the contrary, when voices are silenced and connections are cut, anger doesn't fade. It simply transforms into something else, quieter, harder to track, and more dangerous. A regime that must rely on large-scale violence to maintain order is never truly stable. Violence can silence the noise, but it cannot build trust. And once trust is fractured, any sense of stability becomes temporary at best. Iran is living in that fragile state right now, not peaceful enough to feel secure, yet not chaotic enough to collapse. It is this fragile in-between that worries strategic planners the most. In the broader picture, Iran is not just the internal story of a single Middle Eastern country. It is a crucial link in the already fragile chain of regional stability. An unstable Iran poses risks to global energy routes, to the security of neighboring states, and to the deepening involvement of outside powers. The Middle East is no stranger to conflict, but each time Iran enters a period of crisis, its shockwaves always travel far beyond its borders. For the US and the international community, this is not simply a matter of force or military intervention. It's a test of how to deal with regimes that are weakening, but still dangerous enough to trigger a major crisis. Intervening too early could ignite the very conflict everyone hopes to avoid. Intervening too late could make every option dramatically more costly. And in some scenarios, not intervening at all may no longer be a safe choice either. For the people of Iran, this moment feels like a chapter of history being written in the dark. No headlines, no bright flashes, but full of loss and sacrifice. That chapter may not yet have reached its conclusion, but with every passing day, it is shaping the future of an entire nation and influencing the regional order for years to come. In the end, the real question isn't whether Iran will return to stability, it's how that instability will be released from within through a dangerous internal transformation, or from without through a confrontation no one truly wants. If you have your own thoughts on the future of Iran and the Middle East, Share them in the comments below. These conversations help us explore this complex hotspot from multiple perspectives and understand it more deeply together. And if you found this analysis helpful, don't forget to subscribe. There's much more to come as we continue unpacking the turbulent, high-stakes stories shaping our world today.